there are fires that destroy, and then there are fires that erase. On the night of December 24th, 1945, a house in Fayetteville, West Virginia, burned to the ground in less than 45 minutes. The Sodder family lost everything: their home, their belongings, and, by all appearances, 5 of their 10 children. The official record called it a tragedy. The coroner called it an accident, and the state of West Virginia called the case closed before the ashes had even cooled. But George Sodder didn't call it anything. George Sodder stood in the snow, staring at the smoldering foundation of his life, and noticed something that no one in authority seemed willing to acknowledge. There were no bones, no remains, no teeth, no trace of 5 human beings who were supposed to have perished in that inferno. Nothing. Just a silence where 5 children used to be, and a government that seemed remarkably uninterested in asking why. Now, more than 75 years later, the case of the Sodder children remains one of the most haunting, most baffling, and most deliberately ignored disappearances in American history. And what you are about to hear will make you question not just what happened on that Christmas Eve, but who made sure no one ever found out. To understand what was lost, you first have to understand what existed. George Sodder had come to America from Italy in 1908, a young man with a heavy accent, calloused hands, and an absolute conviction that the New World offered something the Old World could not: a fair chance. He settled in Fayetteville, a small coal mining town nestled in the hills of West Virginia, and he built a life with the kind of stubborn, methodical patience that immigrants often carry like a second skin. He married Jenny, a woman of equal resolve and far sharper instincts. Together, they built a trucking business, bought land on Beach Creek Road, and raised a family that by 1945 had grown to 10 children. Their names were John, Martha, Louis, Jenny, Georgiana, Sylvia, Betty, Frankie, Morris, and the youngest, Jenny Jr., who was still barely more than a toddler. The house on Beach Creek Road was large by rural West Virginia standards. It had to be. 10 children filled every corner of it with noise and argument and laughter, and George and Jenny presided over the chaos with the particular authority of parents who had worked too hard to tolerate disorder. The older children helped with the business. The younger ones went to school. There were rules, routines, and the kind of structured warmth that holds large families together against the pressure of the world outside. George Sodder was not a man without opinions. He was vocal about politics. Specifically, he was openly critical of Benito Mussolini and the Italian fascist movement at a time when many Italian-American communities were still deeply conflicted about their loyalty. He wrote letters. He argued in public. He made himself known as a man who would not be silenced. This detail would return later, quietly and with devastating implications. But on the night of December 24th, 1945, none of that mattered yet. What mattered was that it was Christmas Eve, and the Sodder household was alive with the specific, irreplaceable electricity of a family on the edge of celebration. The fire started somewhere around midnight. Jenny Sodder woke first. She smelled smoke, felt the heat pressing through the walls of the bedroom, and understood immediately that something was catastrophically wrong. She woke George. They roused the older children who were sleeping in rooms nearby and moved toward the stairs, calling out for the younger ones, for Morris, for Martha, for Louis, for Jenny Jr., for Betty. What happened next is where the official story and the evidence begin to quietly but irreconcilably diverge. George Sodder ran outside to find a ladder he stored reliably against the side of the house every single night. It was gone. He ran to his 2 trucks, intending to position one beneath the second-floor window and climb up to reach the children trapped above. Neither truck would start. Both had been running perfectly the day before. On this night, in this cold, they simply refused. He tried to re-enter the house through the front door. The flames drove him back. His son John tried to climb the house's exterior. The fire was too intense. A neighbor heard the screams and came to help. Nothing could be done. The house burned with a ferocity that seemed to exceed what a residential fire should achieve, consuming the structure entirely in under 45 minutes and leaving almost nothing behind but a blackened foundation and a silence that settled over the Sodder family like a second catastrophe. George and Jenny survived. 4 of their 10 children survived. 5 did not come out of that house, or at least 5 did not come out. The distinction matters more than it might initially seem. In the days that followed, as the ashes cooled and investigators began their cursory examination of the site, something became apparent that should have stopped the entire official process in its tracks. There were no human remains, no bones, no teeth, no fragments, no trace whatsoever of 5 children who, according to the official account, had perished in a residential house fire. George Sodder, who was not a forensic expert but was an intelligent and methodical man, immediately raised this point. He raised it loudly, he raised it repeatedly, and he was met again and again with a response that ranged from dismissive to openly hostile. The fire chief, F.J. Morris, conducted what he described as a thorough examination of the scene, and declared that the fire had burned hot enough to entirely consume the children's bodies. He reached this conclusion quickly, without the involvement of any forensic specialist, and without apparent concern for the fact that it contradicted established science. Human bone does not simply vanish in a residential house fire. It is one of the most durable biological materials in existence, capable of surviving temperatures far exceeding what a house fire typically generates. Forensic pathologists know this. Archaeologists know this. Anyone who has studied the subject for even a brief time knows this. The bones of the Pompeii victims survived nearly 2,000 years. The bones of fire victims are recovered from crime scenes every year. The bones of Morris, Martha, Louis, Jenny Jr., and Betty Sodder were never found. Not a fragment, not a tooth, not a single piece of evidence that 5 human children had ever been in that house when it burned. The coroner, without examining the site personally, signed off on a death certificate for all 5 children. The case was declared closed. George Sodder was not finished. As the immediate shock of the disaster began to recede, George and Jenny Sodder began to reconstruct the night with the kind of careful, grieving attention that only parents who refuse to accept an impossible answer are capable of. The ladder was missing. George had stored it against the side of the house, as he did every night without exception. On the night of the fire, it was gone. It was later found, weeks afterward, in a ditch some distance from the property, a detail that the investigating authorities treated as irrelevant. The trucks would not start. 2 vehicles that had been in perfect working order the previous day both failed simultaneously on the one night they were needed most. Mechanics who later examined the engines found that the ignition systems appeared to have been tampered with. The telephone line had gone dead. Jenny had attempted to call for help and found the line completely unresponsive. A telephone company employee later discovered that the line had been cut, not frayed, not broken by the fire's heat, but cut cleanly, at a point on the property that would have been accessible from the outside. Taken individually, any one of these details might be dismissed as coincidence. A misplaced ladder, a cold night and reluctant engines, a line brought down by weather or age. Taken together, they form the outline of something that the word accident cannot contain. Someone had removed the ladder. Someone had interfered with the trucks. Someone had cut the telephone line. And they had done it before the fire started, before any of these things would have been rendered irrelevant by the flames. George Sodder began to understand that his family had not been the victims of a tragedy. They had been the target of a plan. Word travels differently in small towns. It moves through kitchens and church pews and the counters of general stores, carrying details that never make it into official reports. And in the weeks and months that followed the fire on Beach Creek Road, those unofficial channels began to carry something that gave George and Jenny Sodder a reason to keep asking questions. Witnesses came forward. Not many, not loudly, but they came. A woman named Mrs. Ida Crutchfield reported that she had seen a man at a local motel in the days before the fire, behaving in a manner she found suspicious. She later told investigators that she had seen a car full of people driving away from the direction of the Sodder property on the night of the fire. Well, after midnight, moving fast, with what appeared to be children visible in the vehicle. A bus driver reported that in the days following the fire, he had seen several children at a motel in another county who matched the descriptions of the missing Sodder children. The children appeared frightened. They were accompanied by adults the bus driver did not recognize. When he mentioned this to the motel clerk, he was told that the group had already checked out. A woman who worked at a Charleston hotel reported that she had seen a group consisting of several young children and two women who appeared to be Italian, arriving on the night of December 26, 1945, 2 days after the fire. The children were quiet. Too quiet, she said. The kind of quiet that is imposed rather than natural. None of these witness accounts were followed up by state authorities with any apparent urgency. None of them appeared in the official record of the investigation. They existed only in the margins, in letters, in interviews conducted decades later by private investigators, in the fragmented testimony of people who had seen something and been given nowhere official to put it. In the weeks before the fire, 2 encounters occurred that the Sodder family would later view through an entirely different lens. The first involved an insurance salesman who had visited the Sodder home not long before Christmas. George had declined to purchase additional coverage, and the salesman had reportedly responded with a comment that struck the family as deeply unusual. He had gestured toward the house and said, in words that Jenny Sodder would repeat for the rest of her life, "Your house is going to go up in smoke, and your children are going to be destroyed." The second encounter was with a stranger who had appeared at the property some time before the fire, claiming to be checking the fuse box. George did not recall having requested any such inspection, and the man's behavior struck him as evasive. Later, when George inspected the fuse box after the fire, he found it undisturbed, but he also found evidence that the wiring had been interfered with in a way consistent with how a fire might be started remotely or on a delay. Both encounters pointed in the same direction. Someone had known the fire was coming. Someone had tried, perhaps clumsily, to warn the family. And someone had ensured that the conditions necessary for disaster and for escape were prepared in advance. George had been outspoken about Mussolini. He had made enemies in certain circles of the Italian-American community, communities that, in the 1940s, in isolated parts of West Virginia, were not without connections to organizations that understood the uses of fire. The Mafia was not a name George Sodder was willing to say aloud, but it was a word that others, more quietly, had begun to use. George Sodder was not a man who surrendered. He was a man who had built his life from nothing in a country that was not his birthplace, who had raised 10 children and run a business and planted himself on a hillside in West Virginia with the permanent intention of staying. And when the authorities told him that his children were dead and the case was closed, he responded the way a man like George Sodder responds to an answer he does not believe. He kept asking. He hired private investigators. He wrote letters to government officials, to the FBI, to anyone who might have the authority and the will to take the disappearance of 5 children seriously. He received polite responses and bureaucratic deflections, and occasionally no response at all. He exhumed what remained of the fire site and hired a professional excavation crew to sift through every inch of the foundation. They found a human liver, intact, undamaged by fire, buried in the soil beneath the ruins. The liver was moist, fresh, and clearly had not been exposed to the temperatures the house fire had generated. A pathologist examined it and determined that it could not have come from the 1945 fire. The state dismissed the finding. The case remained closed. And so George Sodder did what a man does when the system has failed him. He built a billboard. On the property where his house had stood, George Sodder erected a large roadside sign bearing the photographs of his 5 missing children. Beneath the photographs, in large letters, he stated the facts as he understood them, that these children had not been accounted for, that the investigation had been inadequate, and that any information leading to their whereabouts would be rewarded. The billboard stood for years, decades. It became a landmark in Fayetteville, a monument to refusal, to a father who had been told to grieve and had chosen instead to search. Drivers passing through on Route 16 would slow down to read it, would see the faces of Morris and Martha and Louie and Jenny Jr. and Betty, frozen at the ages they had been on Christmas Eve 1945, staring out at a world that had mostly forgotten to look for them. George Sodder tended that billboard until he died. For 20 years, George and Jenny Sodder lived in the particular purgatory of parents who do not know. They grieved without the certainty that allowed grief to move toward acceptance. They searched without the evidence that allowed searching to move toward answers. They existed in the space between loss and hope, and that space is one of the cruelest places a human being can inhabit. And then, in 1967, a letter arrived. It came with no return address. The postmark indicated it had been sent from somewhere in Kentucky. Inside the envelope was a single photograph. The photograph showed a young man. He appeared to be in his mid-20s. He was looking directly at the camera with an expression that was difficult to read, watchful, perhaps, or guarded. On the back of the photograph, written in an unfamiliar hand, were 4 words. Louis Sodder. I love, brother. Louis Sodder had been 9 years old when he disappeared. The young man in the photograph was the age Louis would have been in 1967. Jenny Sodder, who had looked at the faces of her children every day for 22 years, studied the photograph with the specific intensity of a mother whose memory of her child was the most reliable instrument she possessed. She believed it was him. She was never able to prove it. The letter could not be traced. The photograph could not be definitively identified. But the photograph represented something beyond its immediate mystery. It meant that someone, somewhere, knew that the Sodder children had survived the fire. It meant that at least one person was willing, 22 years later, to send the family a signal, enough to confirm what George and Jenny had always believed. Their children had not burned. Their children had been taken. George Sodder died in 1969. He died without answers. He died with the billboard still standing, and the case still officially closed, and the bones of his 5 children still nowhere to be found. Jenny Sodder lived until 1989. In her final years, she continued to receive occasional correspondence from people who claimed to have information, leads that went cold, witnesses who would not be named, fragments of testimony that accumulated into a body of suggestion without ever cohering into proof. The billboard came down after Jenny's death, taken down by the surviving Sodder children who had grown into adults carrying the specific, unresolvable grief of siblings who do not know whether their brothers and sisters are dead or alive, and who have spent their entire lives in the shadow of a question that no institution was willing to seriously pursue. Sylvia Sodder, the youngest surviving child, became the family's most persistent advocate in the decades that followed. She pursued every lead she could find, engaged researchers and journalists and investigators, and made clear in interview after interview that the family's position had never changed. The children were not in that house when it burned. The children were taken. And the failure of West Virginia authorities to pursue that possibility with anything resembling rigor was not incompetence, it was a choice. Who made that choice, and why, and on whose behalf? Those questions have never been definitively answered. There is a particular quality to cold cases that involve children. They do not age the way other mysteries age. They do not become historical curiosities or academic puzzles. They remain, always and permanently, urgent, because the alternative to urgency is the acceptance that the children do not matter enough to keep looking. George and Jenny Sodder refused that acceptance. They built a billboard and kept it lit and wrote letters until their hands could no longer hold a pen. They did this not because they were naive or delusional, but because the evidence, the physical, verifiable, scientifically grounded evidence, told them that their children had not died in that fire. The bones were not there. They were never there. And yet the case was closed. And yet the death certificates were signed. And yet West Virginia moved on. And the federal government moved on. And the decades moved on. And 5 children who may have been alive somewhere in America in 1945 were declared officially dead by a process that lasted less than a week and involved no forensic expertise whatsoever. The photograph arrived in 1967 and went nowhere. The witnesses spoke and were not recorded. The liver was found in the foundation and was dismissed. The circumstantial evidence of tampering, the ladder, the trucks, the telephone line, was acknowledged and then set aside. This is what institutional indifference looks like when it is applied to a family that is inconvenient. The Sodder children have never been found. Their fate has never been conclusively established. The photograph of the young man who may have been Louis exists in the family's archive, staring out from 1967 with an expression that suggests he knew exactly who he was, and had been told, perhaps, that being found was more dangerous than staying hidden. Somewhere, sometime, someone knows what happened on Beech Creek Road on Christmas Eve, 1945. Someone knows where the 5 children went after the fire was set, and the ladder was moved and the trucks were made to fail. Someone knows who cut the telephone line, and why, and on whose orders. That someone has never spoken. Or, if they have spoken, no one with the authority to act has chosen to listen. The billboard is gone. George and Jenny are gone. The house on Beech Creek Road is gone. But the question survives all of them. 5 children walked into Christmas Eve and did not come out the other side. And in the long silence that has followed, the most disturbing possibility is not that they died, but that they lived somewhere without their names, and that the world decided it was easier not to know.